The bread was the last of it. Eleanor Marsh knew this the way she knew the state of the household linen and the thinness of the kitchen stores, and the particular silence her stepmother cultivated in the hours before announcing a decision already made. She held the small loaf in both hands as she crossed the yard behind the Ashfield market, and she did not slow her step when she saw the man sitting against the stone wall, his coat so worn the wool had gone to a soft grey fray at every seam, his boots split at the left toe, his head bowed as though he had been bowing it for a very long time and had simply forgotten to stop. She did not ask herself whether she could afford the gesture. That calculation ran in her bones without her permission. She had already made it. She set the bread on the stone beside him and walked on. And she did not look back, because looking back would have made the gift into a performance, and she had no interest in performing decency for an audience that did not exist. The November air had the particular bite that came off the moors in the third week of the month, and it found every gap in her wool pelisse with the patience of a thing that had nowhere else to be. She turned at the corner of the market square and moved toward the milliner's, where her stepmother, Mrs. Dorothea Marsh, was waiting to make final arrangements for a bonnet she neither needed nor intended to pay for before the quarter. Eleanor was 22 and had been managing the Marsh household accounts since she was 17, which meant she was aware of exactly how little stood between her family and a creditor's letter. She was also aware with the particular lucidity that came from 5 years of quiet observation that her stepmother was not. Dorothea did not understand accounts. She understood the impression accounts created, and she preferred that impression to the accounts themselves, which explained the bonnet and the new withdrawing room curtains, and the invitation to the Whitmore assembly that had gone out under the Marsh name without anyone consulting the Marsh purse. What it did not explain, or rather what Eleanor had stopped trying to explain, was the arrangement Dorothea had been pursuing for the past 3 months regarding Sir Phineas Alcott, a widower of 54 with a Lincolnshire estate and a very clear preference for a young wife who would manage his children and not ask inconvenient questions about the condition of the house. Dorothea had been nudging Eleanor toward this arrangement with the relentless cheerfulness of a woman who believes she is doing someone a favour. Eleanor had been deflecting with the same resource she brought to every difficulty. She continued to be herself, quietly, without announcement, and waited for something to give. She found her stepmother in the milliner's, turning a chip straw bonnet in both hands with the concentration of a woman examining military strategy. Beside her stood Mrs. Alcott, the elder, Sir Phineas's sister, who had arrived from Lincolnshire the previous Tuesday, and whose opinion of Eleanor she had conveyed on their first introduction through a single slow appraisal that began at Eleanor's hem and arrived at her face carrying none of the warmth of a conclusion. "There she is," Dorothea said with the particular brightness she reserved for audiences. "Miss Marsh at last. We were speaking of the Whitmore assembly. Mrs. Alcott was asking whether you dance." "Tolerably," Eleanor said. Mrs. Alcott set the chip straw down. "Sir Phineas values accomplishment in a domestic setting above the drawing-room variety," she said, in the tone of someone delivering terms. "I hope you play." "A little," Eleanor said. This was not untrue. She played with considerable precision and no ornament, which was the only kind of playing that made sense to her. She did not offer the distinction. If you find this story already pulling at something you did not expect, stay close to it. That pull is the point. The assembly was to be held that Friday, and Dorothea had committed Eleanor's attendance without inquiry, which meant Eleanor spent the intervening days completing the household accounts, reordering the kitchen supplies that Dorothea's last entertainment had depleted, writing 2 letters on her stepmother's behalf, and fitting herself into the one evening gown she owned, that still answered to the word presentable. A deep green silk with a high waist and long fitted sleeves that had belonged to her mother, and which Eleanor had let out once and taken in once, and which now fitted the way old things fit when they know you. She dressed her own hair in the glass of her small bedroom, the candle making the work slower than it needed to be. She did not mind. She had learned to do most things by candlelight. The market square was quieter in the early morning, 2 days after she had left the bread. She was crossing it on her way to the bookseller's, which was one of the few places in Ashfield she went because she wanted to, and not because someone required something of her. The man was there again. Not sitting against the wall this time, but standing beside the water trough with his back to her, looking out toward the road that ran east. And she noticed before she had made any conscious decision to notice that his coat was the same grey frayed wool, and his boots were the same split leather, but that he stood as though the coat were ornamental and the torn boot an afterthought, his back straight in a manner that had nothing to do with effort. It was the posture of a man who had never learned to take up less space, which was different from the posture of a man who had fought to take up more. She filed the distinction away without examining it and went into the bookseller's. He was there when she came out 20 minutes later, a volume of Cowper under her arm. He had turned from the road and was watching the market square with an attentiveness that did not match the coat or the boots either. He looked at her when she emerged from the shop, and for a moment neither of them spoke, which might have been unremarkable, except that he looked at her the way people look at things they have already decided about, and she could not account for it. "Good morning," she said, because she was who she was. "Good morning, miss," he said. His voice was measured and unhurried and placed every word where it intended to land. He did not add anything. He did not apologize for being where he was, which was a thing most men in worn coats did. She went on across the square, aware of him watching. She did not look back, for the same reason she had not looked back at the wall. His name, she learned 3 days later from Tobias. The bookseller who had it from the innkeeper at the White Hart was Mr. Carew. He had been in Ashfield for a fortnight, staying at the inn, asking after the condition of the roads to the north, which many travellers did in November when the moors were uncertain. He had paid his reckoning without difficulty. He ate in the public room and spoke to no one in particular. Tobias had sold him a map of the northern counties and a volume of agricultural essays, which Tobias found interesting. Eleanor found it interesting too, which was the first indication she had that she had begun to notice him with something other than the detached attention she extended to every small peculiarity of a small market town. The Whitmore Assembly was the kind of evening that announced itself through the smell of too many candles and too much rice powder in a room designed for 40 and holding 63. Eleanor stood beside the refreshment table for the first half hour, while Dorothea circulated with Mrs. Alcott, and Sophinius pressed through the crowd toward them with the purposefulness of a man who had been told exactly where to go. He was not unkind. Eleanor gave him that. He was attentive in the way of a man conducting a practical survey, his eyes going to her hands and then her face, and then the room with the sequence of someone taking inventory. He asked her twice about housekeeping and once about her health, and she answered clearly each time, and he seemed satisfied in the manner of a man ticking items from a list. It was during the second set, when she had been led to the floor by a Mr. Henley, who danced with the grim determination of someone completing a duty, that she became aware of Mr. Carew standing near the door. He was in the same coat. He had done something to repair the frayed seam at the left shoulder, she noticed, and his boots had been cleaned. But the coat was the coat. And beside the Whitmore Assembly's blue wool and yellow brocade, he looked like a sketch from a different story entirely. He was not dancing, he was watching. Not the room in general, but with that same particular attentiveness she had first noticed over the water trough, calibrated and still. He looked at her when she came off the floor, and she looked away first, which was not what she had intended. Dorothea caught her arm near the punch bowl. "Sir Phineas has asked your father's steward for an appointment," she said, her voice carrying the bright, decisive quality of something already settled. "He wishes to discuss terms by the end of the month. You are sensible enough to understand what that means for this family." She did not phrase it as a question. Eleanor held her punch glass and said nothing, and stood inside her own silence the way she stood inside the police in November air, without protest, without collapse. She did not see Mr. Carew leave. She saw him the following morning. She had gone out early with the intention of calling on Mrs. Greaves, the elderly widow who lived at the end of Church Lane and who had been unwell, and she carried a jar of broth from the Marsh kitchen and the Cowper volume because Mrs. Greaves liked being read to. Mr. Carew was coming out of the White Hart yard as Eleanor passed, and he checked when he saw her, a brief pause that resolved itself into a slight inclination of the head. "Miss Marsh," he said, which meant someone had told him her name. She stopped. The jar of broth was warm through her gloves. "Mr. Carew," she said. He looked at the jar and the book and back at her face. "The roads north are open," he said. "I am told it has been a dry enough fortnight to make them passable." "You are leaving Ashfield," she said. "Not immediately." He said it simply, with no more weight than the words required. He glanced at the jar again. "Is Mrs. Greaves poorly?" "A cold that will not leave," Eleanor said. "She is 81 and the cold ones linger." "I know her cottage," he said. "The path along the churchyard wall is drier than the lane." He told her the way as if he had walked it often, with the particular detail of someone accustomed to terrain, and she thanked him and went on. She did not ask herself how he knew Mrs. Greaves's cottage. She filed it the way she filed the posture and the voice and the map of the northern counties, in the place she kept things she did not yet have a name for. She was reading to Mrs. Greaves in the low armchair by the cottage fire an hour later when she became aware, through the half-open inner door, of the housekeeper's voice in the kitchen. Mrs. Greaves had gone to sleep in the middle of Cowper, which was not unusual, and Eleanor had let the reading trail off and had been watching the fire think. The housekeeper, old Bridget, was talking to the kitchen girl about the White Hart, and Eleanor was not listening in any pointed way until she heard her own name. "Sir Phineas's sister was asking after her particularly," Bridget said, with the relish of someone transmitting intelligence. "Whether she was capable, whether she had the temperament. And you know what Mrs. Alcott said," she said. "I told her so plainly, the girl is quiet enough and not unhandsome, but she has no portion worth speaking of, and the stepmother is a fool with money. She said she thought Phineas could do a great deal better. She said it not 10 feet from Mrs. Dorothea, who pretended not to hear." Eleanor did not move. The fire had been burning steadily for the better part of an hour, and the room was warm, but she felt the cold in her spine that had nothing to do with temperature. She had understood, in some abstract practical sense, that the Alcott interest was conditional. She had not understood until that moment that the condition was being evaluated aloud, in public, by a woman with the confident cruelty of someone who knew her opinions carried weight. She sat with it for a long time after Bridget's voice moved to other subjects. Mrs. Greaves slept on. The fire settled. Eleanor set the Cowper face down on the arm of the chair and looked at her own hands in her lap, the gloves she had not taken off, and she understood with a clarity that arrived without drama that her stepmother was going to sell her into that arrangement if she could, and that Mrs. Alcott's reservations were the only thing standing in the way, and that Mrs. Alcott's reservations were about the portion, not the woman. She was nobody's asset to place. She had understood this the way she understood most things that mattered, quietly, without the relief of being able to say it aloud to anyone who would hear it correctly. Mr. Carew found her on the churchyard path on her way back, or she found him, or they arrived at the same narrow passage at the same moment in the way that seemed, looking back, to have had a shape to it. He was coming from the direction of the church, carrying nothing, walking with the easy unhurriedness she had come to associate with him. And when they stopped, she was aware of the path being narrow, and the afternoon light coming cold and flat over the church wall and his face being directly in it, level and attentive. "She was sleeping when I left," Eleanor said, because she felt, unreasonably, that she owed him the information. "She sleeps most afternoons," he said. He said it without the self-consciousness of someone who has revealed more than they meant to. He added after a moment, "She knew my father a long time ago. She has been kind enough to allow me to call." She looked at him. He met the look directly and without performance. The afternoon light did nothing to soften the particular quality of stillness around him, the sense of a man conserving something large for a purpose not yet visible. "You are from this part of the country, then?" she said. "From the north of it," he said. "The roads you mentioned." She did not push further, and he offered nothing further, and the path was narrow enough that when he stepped slightly aside to let her pass, his shoulder came within a few inches of hers, and she was aware of the warmth of him through the frayed wool and the cold air between them, and the way he did not move until she had passed. She walked on with her empty jar and her cowper, and the weight of Bridget's voice still sitting in her chest, and she did not look back. She did look back, once, at the gate. He was standing where she had left him. He was watching her go. The appointment Dorothea had arranged for Sir Phineas with the household steward took place 3 days later, on a Friday morning when Eleanor was occupied with the quarterly account books in the small parlour that served as her workroom when the withdrawing room was in use. She heard her stepmother's voice in the hall, brisk and welcoming, and the heavier tread of a visitor, and she did not go out. An hour later, Dorothea appeared in the parlour doorway with the expression she wore when a plan had advanced a stage. "Sir Phineas has made an offer," she said. "It is a generous one, all things considered." Eleanor looked up from the accounts. "All things considered," she said. "He is prepared to overlook the portion." Dorothea's voice carried the particular satisfaction of someone delivering news they have earned. "He asks for an answer within the fortnight. I have told him you are a sensible girl." Eleanor set her pen down. The ink had dried on the last figure she had written, and she could see it clearly. The kitchen account, precisely 7 shillings and 4 pence short of where it needed to be by the end of the month. She looked at her stepmother. She said with the level precision that was the only voice she trusted herself to use in this room, "I will consider it." It was not agreement. Dorothea heard it as agreement. She withdrew, and Eleanor heard her in the hall, telling Sir Phineas's departing footsteps something about January, and she sat with the pen in her hand and the ink drying, and the 7 shillings and 4 pence, and the Bridget's kitchen voice still lodged in the place behind her sternum that had been lodged since the cottage fire, and she thought, she would not be managed out of her own life like a problem in the accounts. Not without making one last choice that was hers. She went to the bookseller's the following morning. Tobias was unpacking a consignment from London, brown paper everywhere, the smell of new binding sharp in the cold air from the door. Mr. Carew was already there. He was standing at the back shelves with a book open in his hands, reading with the focused stillness she had come to recognize, and he looked up when the bell above the door sounded. He closed the book and did not put it down. "Miss Marsh," he said. "Mr. Carew," she said. She went to the shelf she had been intending to visit and found the volume she wanted, which was a collection of agricultural correspondence she had ordered the previous month for a practical reason she did not examine. She carried it to the counter and felt him come to stand beside her, in the way of a man who is doing something specific and careful. He set his own book on the counter. It was the same agricultural essays he had bought from Tobias before, which meant he had read it and wanted another copy, or had given his away. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and Tobias was making a great deal of noise with brown paper on the other side of the shop. "You are leaving," she said quietly, because she had decided she was tired of not saying the things she meant. "Not yet," he said. He was looking at her with that same quality of decision, already made, that she had first registered against the wall in the market square, and she was aware of the counter's edge under her hand, and the warmth of the shop after the cold outside, and the space between them, which was not very much space. "There are matters still requiring my attention," he said. She should have asked what matters. She did not. She paid Tobias for the agricultural correspondence and walked home through the square with the volume under her arm, and the sensation of having been standing on a threshold she could not quite make out the shape of. The letter arrived on Tuesday. Eleanor was the one who took in the post, as she was the one who managed most things that arrived at the Marsh house requiring management. And she sorted the letters at the hall table with the efficiency of practice. One for Dorothea from her cousin in Bath, one for the household from a supplier who was owed money, and one, at the bottom of the small stack, addressed to her in a hand she did not recognize. The seal a plain disc of red wax, without a device. She opened it at the table, alone, because there was no reason to take it elsewhere. It read, "I am aware that an arrangement has been proposed for your future which is not, I believe, what you would choose for yourself. I find I am unable to remain silent on the subject of what you are worth, which is considerably more than the terms being offered. If you will walk in the churchyard on Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock, I will tell you something that may be of use to you. Your servant, R. Carew." She read it twice. She stood with the letter in her hand at the hall table for a time that she did not measure, and, she thought, this was either kindness or impertinence, and she was not certain she could tell the difference from this angle. And then she thought that she had always been better at understanding things in motion than in stillness, and so she went. He was at the lich gate when she arrived, which was 9 o'clock precisely. He had the frayed coat and the cleaned boots and a way of standing against the stone that made the stone look like it had been placed there for his use. The churchyard was cold and quiet. The yews stood dark along the north wall, and the frost had not entirely lifted from the grass. She stopped 2 yards from him and did not say good morning, because they had passed the stage of good mornings. He looked at her for a moment before he spoke. The quality of it was different from the earlier looks, less withheld, and she felt the change as a slight pressure against the chest, like the first push of a door that has been closed for a long time. "I owe you a truth," he said. "You owe me nothing," she said. "I have been calling myself Carew," he said, "because it is my mother's name, and she was from this country, and it seemed, when I came north, the most honest name I could offer a place I wanted to understand without the interference of what I am elsewhere." He paused. He looked at the frost on the grass to her left, briefly, and then back at her. "What I am elsewhere is inconvenient to explain standing at a lich gate in November." He had the smallest smile, not warm exactly, but dry and exact and entirely his. "I had not intended to explain it at all. I had intended to go north, see the roads open, and continue to wherever I was going. And then you set bread beside a stranger's hand without looking back to see whether it was received, and I could not continue to wherever I was going." She was very still. The frost, the yews, the hard grey sky. "You should not have come on the strength of a letter from a man you barely know," he said. "I have the letter in my pocket," she said. "If anything occurs to me, I will read it again." That surprised something in him. She saw it, a brief unguarding, and she felt it in her own chest as a warmth she did not have a period word for, and would not have used one anyway. He took one step toward her, and she did not step back, and the space between them was now the space of a conversation rather than the space of strangers, and the cold was doing nothing to address the warmth. "I want you to go to the Whitmore Assembly on Friday," he said. "Not because Sir Phineas will be there, because I will be there. And there are people I need to speak to before I leave the county, and I would like you to be present for one of those conversations if you are willing." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought of Bridget's kitchen voice and the 7 shillings and 4pence and the letter with the plain red seal. And she thought of who she was when no one important was watching. And she said, "I will be there." She dressed on Friday in the green silk again, her mother's gown, and set her hair in the glass with the single candle. And she did not let herself think about what had been said in the churchyard, beyond the fact that she had heard it clearly and had understood, if not everything, then the weight of it. Dorothea was in high spirits, which meant Sir Phineas had communicated something encouraging, which meant the fortnight's deadline was pressing. Eleanor tied her gloves at the wrist and went down. The Whitmore Assembly on the second Friday was smaller than the first, and the room was the same over-candled warmth. And Sir Phineas was in attendance, and inclined to stand near Eleanor with the purposeful air of a man finalizing an arrangement. She was pleasant to him because she was pleasant to everyone, and she danced the first set with Mr. Henley again because he asked, and she saw no reason to refuse, and she watched the door. He came late. He was not in the frayed coat. He was in a dark blue evening coat, fitted, with a white cravat and a waistcoat that had nothing apologetic about it. And the change was not a change in him, but a change in the frame, the way a portrait looks different when the glass is cleaned. He was the same posture, the same economy, and he was with 2 men Eleanor did not recognize, one of whom had the bearing of a steward, and the other of whom, she realized, looking more carefully, she did recognize Mr. Hargreaves, the Whitmore family's man of business, who had been in Ashfield for the past week settling an estate matter in the valley. The room noticed him. It did not announce this noticing. It performed it in the small adjustments of people who have suddenly registered something they had not accounted for. The slight turning of heads, the repositioning of conversations, the way Mrs. Alcott's sentence trailed off in the middle of something she was saying to Dorothea near the refreshment table. Eleanor watched all of this from the edge of the floor and felt the room's quiet rearrangement as though she were feeling it from the outside of her own skin. Mr. Hargreaves came across the floor to where she was standing. He greeted her with the particular courtesy of a man performing a deliberate act, and then he half-turned and addressed the man in the blue coat. "Your Grace, may I present Miss Marsh?" The room went still. Not loud still, but the particular stillness of a drawing room when the actual weight of a situation arrives, and no one has a script for it yet. Eleanor heard Sir Phineas 3 yards away draw a breath that was not quite a word. She heard Dorothea's cup find its saucer with slightly too much force. She was looking at Mr. Carew, who was looking at her, and he was exactly who he had been in the frayed coat and outside the lich gate and across the bookseller's counter. And she was also aware that he was apparently a duke, which the room was taking in with the systematic shock of people revising a very long set of assumptions. "Miss Marsh," he said, and his voice was the same measured, unhurried voice it had always been. And he inclined his head with the ease of someone who had been doing this since before he could reasonably remember. "I am glad you came." She held his gaze. She was aware of the green silk and the room, and the frost's residue on November air, and the bread on the stone wall, and the letter in her pocket, and every moment between those two things. And she said, "I told you I would." The colour in Dorothea's face had shifted in the way of someone doing rapid and unfavourable arithmetic. Mrs. Alcott was very still in the manner of a woman whose social script had encountered a fact it had not planned for. Sir Phineas had taken half a step back, then half a step forward, then settled into a kind of uncertain hovering that resolved itself, after a moment, into a bow toward a man whose coat he had not noticed at the first assembly. It was Mr. Hargreaves who spoke into the drawing-room's reorganizing silence. He had the calm efficiency of a man used to delivering documents in front of witnesses. "His Grace the Duke of Morven," he said, to no one in particular and therefore to everyone, "has been in the county this past month in connection with the Northern Estate matters and a particular interest in the condition of the Ashfield Valley roads." He folded his hands. "He has asked me to confirm the terms of a letter sent earlier this week," Dorothea said, in a voice whose brightness had gone thin at the edges. "A letter? I was not aware of a letter." "It was addressed to Miss Marsh," Mr. Hargreaves said. The room held the moment the way good rooms do. Eleanor felt it as a pressure in the chest that was not entirely unpleasant, and she kept her eyes on the man in the blue coat and the white cravat, who was watching her with the same expression he had worn against every wall and threshold and narrow path, decided and direct and quiet. And she thought of everything he had not said in all the weeks he had been in the frayed coat, and she felt the shape of what it meant to have been seen before any of this mattered. Dorothea tried once more. She found her voice and produced a version of it, directed at Mrs. Alcott, that carried the note of someone repositioning themselves in a room they have just understood to be different from the one they entered. "Well," she said, "how extraordinary." Mrs. Alcott said nothing at all. Her silence was the particular silence of a woman realizing she had committed several remarks about portion and temperament in public, in a drawing-room, in a county that had just produced a duke from behind a pair of split boots. Her face had the quality of someone standing in weather they had not prepared for. Sir Phineas, to his credit, was gracious. He found Eleanor later in the evening near the refreshment table and said, with something that approached genuine decency, "I understand there has been a prior claim on your consideration, Miss Marsh. I wish you well." It cost him something. Eleanor gave him credit for it. The rooms thinned towards 11. Eleanor had stayed not because Dorothea required it, but because she had not been ready to leave, and she found herself near the tall window at the far end of the room where the candles had burned lower, and the air was cooler. He came to stand beside her. They faced the dark glass together for a moment, which reflected the room and both of them in it, and the reflection had the quality of a thing already finished, already settled. "Your Grace," she said. "The name is Rowan," he said. "You may use it or not, as you prefer, but I find, having worn the other thing for a month in your company, that I would rather be answered as myself." She looked at the glass. "You ate my bread," she said. "I did," he said. "I was not, strictly speaking, in want of it. I had gone out on foot that morning because I find the town more legible without the carriage, and I had not brought anything, and I was sitting against that wall considering the roads, and then you appeared and set the bread down and walked on, and did not look back, and I thought, she did that for no audience. She has done a great many things for no audience, I suspect." He paused. "I went back the following morning to see if I could find you." She was quiet for a moment, feeling the warmth of the fire from across the room, and his shoulder 2 inches from hers, and the dark glass in front of them. "The letter said I am worth considerably more than the terms being offered," she said. "Yes," he said. "That remains my assessment." She turned from the glass. He turned from the glass. The room behind them was quiet, the candles guttered to their lower light. The drawing-room crowd thinned to its later configuration of small clusters and comfortable silences. She looked at him directly, the way she had looked at the bread and the accounts and the frost and every difficult thing she had faced without flinching. And she said, "I should like to know the roads north, when they are open." He looked at her with the expression she would come, in time, to know as his version of warmth, which was very still and very direct and not inclined toward ornament. "They will open in the spring," he said. She held out her hand and he took it. Inside the green silk and the November evening and the quiet of the Whitmore Assembly's late hour, and the warmth of his hand was the warmth of the fire, and the warm weight of the bread in her palms on a cold morning in a market square, and the room went on being the room around them, and Eleanor Marsh stood inside it in a manner she had not stood anywhere before. Entirely at rest inside a moment she had not expected to reach, wearing nothing but herself. She walked home with Dorothea at 11, who was very quiet in a manner that was not her usual quiet. The moon was up, and the square was silver and cold, and Eleanor's breath made small clouds in the November dark. She did not explain anything to Dorothea, because Dorothea had what she needed, which was the reality of the evening, which would do the explaining without Eleanor's assistance. She said good night at the door of the house and went upstairs to her small room, and she lit the candle and set the letter from her pocket on the writing desk, the plain red seal and the familiar hand, and she did not read it again. She had understood it the first time. She set it beside the agricultural correspondence she had bought from Tobias, and she sat down in the chair by the small fire and let the warmth find her, and she stayed there until the fire had burned itself to a comfortable glow. In the spring, when the roads north opened, there was a letter, not from Mr. Hargreaves and not bearing the formal devices of Morven, but in the same measured hand that had written about Worth and market squares and November roads, and it said, "The roads are clear. I find I cannot recommend the journey without a companion who has read the agricultural correspondence and has opinions about it. I remain, as ever, yours." She answered it at the same writing desk, in the same candle's light, with the same pen her mother had left her. She did not take long to write it. She had known what she was going to say since the lich gate in November, since the bread on the stone wall, since the moment she had not looked back and found, impossibly, that being looked at anyway was not the diminishment she had always prepared herself for. It was the opposite of that. It was the thing she had been waiting, in the patient way she waited for everything that mattered, to have a name for at last. She sealed the letter. She gave it to the post. Outside the parlour window the yard was green, and the morning was clear, and the light came through in the long gold way that only April managed, laying itself across the writing desk, and the ink, and the cowper on the shelf. And Eleanor Marsh sat inside it with her hands in her lap and said nothing, because some things were better held than spoken, and because the silence was hers, and because she had already been seen.